Archival records from the St. Landry Parish Courthouse confirm the birth occurred in the winter of 1845, a year marked by an unusually harsh frost that killed half the sugarcane crop along the Bayou Teche. The entry in the plantation ledger is stark, listing only Negro boy, defective, beside the date, a bureaucratic erasure of a life that would eventually dismantle an empire. To understand the magnitude of what happened on the Judge estate, one must first confront the physical reality of the child who entered the world that night. Historical accounts and passed-down oral traditions agree on the defining feature. The infant's skull was severely distended, swollen with fluid to a size that defied comprehension. It was a biological anomaly that should have resulted in immediate death, yet the child drew breath, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rattling gasps that filled the cramped cabin. The midwife, a woman named Hattie, who had ushered over 300 souls into bondage during her decades of service, found herself paralyzed by the sight. She had seen club feet, cleft palates, and stillborns, but nothing had prepared her for the disproportionate mass of the child's head. In a letter discovered in a New Orleans archive decades later, she described the infant as appearing top-heavy, a fragile vessel, threatening to snap its own neck under the crushing weight. The mother, a field hand named Esther, lay exhausted on the corn shuck mattress, her eyes searching Hattie's face for a sign that her son would survive. Hattie hesitated, the newborn silent in her hands, before finally wrapping the misshapen head in a strip of clean muslin. The silence in the cabin was heavier than the humid Louisiana air, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thud of sugar stalks being stacked for the mill. Master Silas Judge entered the quarters an hour later, his boots heavy on the wooden boards, accompanied by the sharp smell of cigar smoke and the authority of absolute ownership. He did not approach the bed with compassion. He came as an auditor assessing damaged property. Judge took one look at the infant, who was struggling to lift a head the size of a watermelon, and let out a sharp, dismissive snort of disgust. According to testimony later given by field hands, the master did not see a human child, but a financial liability, a creature too grotesque to fetch a price at the New Orleans slave market and too broken to ever wield a hoe. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the moonlight, and declared the birth a waste of the estate's resources. In his eyes, the deformed skull was not a medical tragedy, but a breach of contract between nature and commerce. "This is a loss, not a living thing," Judge stated, his voice devoid of inflection as he stared at the swaddled bundle. The overseer, a man named Vance, who stood just behind the master, laughed cruelly, suggesting they save themselves the cost of feeding a dud. The master, however, was a man of calculation, not waste. He reasoned that drowning the child might raise awkward questions among the other enslaved people, potentially fueling superstitions that could hurt productivity. He turned his cold gaze to Esther, who had propped herself up on trembling elbows, clutching the wooden frame of the bed. He gave the order that the child was to be kept, but strictly as a burden, refusing to allocate a wet nurse or extra rations for its maintenance. He effectively sentenced the infant to a slow death by neglect, assuming nature would finish what he was too pragmatic to start. When the door slammed shut, leaving the family in the dark, Esther did not weep with despair, but with a fierce, terrifying resolve. She pulled the infant to her chest, her calloused hands cradling the massive, unwieldy head with a tenderness that defied the master's verdict. In the oral histories collected by the Federal Writers Project, it is said that she whispered a promise into the child's ear, a vow that he would not only survive, but outlast the men who mocked his existence. She named him Silas, a direct affront to the master, who had sought to discard him. But in the quarters, he was simply called the boy. She ignored the probability that his neck muscles would fail, just as she ignored the master's decree that he was worthless. She began the arduous process of teaching his body to bear the impossible weight, massaging his stiff neck with rendered lard and holding his head upright for hours each day. The struggle for survival was immediate and brutal, a battle fought against gravity and physiology. For 3 months, the child's existence was precarious, his head lolling uncontrollably to one side, his breathing often labored and shallow. Esther supplemented her meager diet with stolen root vegetables to keep her milk flowing, knowing that if she failed, the child would starve. The other women in the quarter watched with a mixture of pity and superstition. Some believed the child was a sign of bad luck, a curse brought on by the master's harsh treatment of the elderly. Others simply looked away, unable to bear the sight of the grotesque distortion. Yet, the child did not wither. His lungs strengthened, and his grip on Esther's finger grew firm. He refused the death that had been prescribed for him, an act of defiance that went unnoticed by the white men in the big house. By the time the spring thaw arrived and the cane fields turned a vibrant green, the boy had achieved the impossible. His neck, though constantly strained, had developed a thickness of corded muscle that defied his frail frame. He could lift his head, albeit with visible effort, and his eyes, abnormally large and set wide apart, began to track movement with an unnerving precision. It was around this time that the overseer, Vance, began to take a morbid interest in the child's survival. He found the boy's appearance a source of entertainment, a grotesque spectacle to break the monotony of the workday. He would toss small stones near the infant to startle him, laughing when the heavy head wobbled uncontrollably. The cruelty was routine, a petty exercise of power over a being deemed less than human. But it served a purpose the overseer never intended. It toughened the child. The boy they called a monster was slowly, methodically, building the physical architecture necessary for his survival. While other toddlers crawled and babbled, Silas spent his waking hours fighting a war against his own anatomy. Every movement was a calculation of leverage and balance, a necessary education in physics forced upon him by his condition. He learned to compensate for his center of gravity, developing a gait that was jerky and unnatural, but functional. The physical pain was constant, a dull throb in his spine and neck that became the baseline of his existence, a background noise he learned to ignore. This early baptism in endurance forged a stoicism in him that would later terrify those who underestimated him. He was not merely living. He was hardening, turning his body into a vessel capable of carrying a mind that was already beginning to stir with dangerous potential. Esther watched her son with a mix of pride and growing dread. She saw past the distorted skull that caused the white men to avert their eyes. She saw the intensity in his gaze, the way he studied the dust motes in a sunbeam, or the pattern of the wood grain in the cabin walls. There was an awareness in him that seemed far too advanced for an infant, a sense that he was cataloging his surroundings rather than merely experiencing them. She remembered her vow in the shadow of the master's rejection, a promise that he would live to see their oppressors fall. As the years crept forward and the boy grew, the foundation of that promise began to solidify. The defective entry in the ledger was still just ink on paper, but the reality of the child was becoming something far more complex: a survivor, a watcher, and eventually, a weapon waiting to be forged. The legend of the boy with the giant head began as a joke in the overseer's quarters and a whisper in the slave cabins. But the truth was far stranger than the rumors. He was a statistical anomaly, a child born with a body that should have failed, and a brain that seemed to require the extra space. The harsh environment of the Louisiana sugar plantation, with its brutal labor cycles and the constant hum of the grinding mill, provided the backdrop for his formative years. He was surrounded by the machinery of oppression, the ledgers that tallied human lives, the whips that enforced compliance, and the markets that sold families apart. While the master saw a dud and the overseer saw a freak, Esther saw a future that had not yet been written. The stage was set for a conflict that would not be fought with muskets or blades, but with something far more dangerous to a system built on ignorance: the unassailable truth of a superior mind. Historians looking back at the Judge Plantation records from 1845 often overlook the defective boy, dismissing him as a footnote of biological misfortune. This oversight is precisely what allowed the events of the next 17 years to unfold without suspicion. The infrastructure of slavery relied on the dehumanization of its subjects, reducing them to units of labor or profit. When a unit appeared broken, the system stopped watching it. It was this systemic blindness that provided the boy with the cover he would need. The master's arrogance in assuming the child's worthlessness was the first crack in the foundation of his authority, a crack that would widen until the entire edifice collapsed. The boy named Silas was alive, and he was waiting. As the calendar turned to 1847, the dynamic on the Judge Plantation shifted from neglect to active persecution. The overseer, Mr. Vance, found his boredom alleviated by the existence of the toddler, viewing the child's deformity as a source of cruel entertainment rather than a tragedy. Historical accounts suggest that Vance was a man of mediocre intelligence, but abundant malice, characteristics that made him particularly susceptible to underestimating those he sought to torment. He began to use the boy as a prop for gambling, forcing the enslaved women to hold the child upright, while white men placed wagers on whether his spine would snap under the weight of his own skull. These degrading spectacles occurred with regularity, turning the child's struggle for physical stability into a marketplace of morbid curiosity. The torment was not limited to the white staff. The psychological pressure of slavery often forced the oppressed to mimic the cruelty of their masters to secure their own relative safety. Some of the enslaved field hands, seeking to distance themselves from the lowest rung of the social ladder, joined in the mockery, referring to the boy as a gargoyle or a dud. They laughed when he stumbled, a defensive mechanism to avoid acknowledging the fragility of their own positions. This isolation meant that Silas grew up without the camaraderie typically found in the quarters, forcing him into a state of hyper-observation. While other children played with sticks and mud, Silas watched the faces of the men who bet on his death, his large, wide-set eyes absorbing the cadence of their cruelty. Survival required more than just endurance. It necessitated the rapid development of compensatory strength that defied medical expectation. By the time he reached 18 months of age, the boy's neck muscles had thickened into dense cords, resembling twisted rope beneath his skin. The physical exertion required to simply hold his head up was equivalent to a constant state of heavy lifting, and his body responded with an accelerated musculature that surprised the midwife, Hattie. He did not cry when he fell, a behavior that unnerved those who witnessed it. Instead, he would silently rise, his jaw set in a rigid line, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if calculating the distance to a destination only he could see. The turning point in the boy's hidden development occurred in the early spring of 1847, a moment documented not in plantation records, but in the oral histories passed down through the families of the enslaved. Esther was working near the main house, sorting laundry in the yard, while the toddler sat on a quilt nearby. A primer, discarded by the master's son, lay forgotten in the dirt, its pages fluttering in the breeze. Silas pointed a chubby, dirt-stained finger at the object, his movements deliberate and precise. He spoke a single word. his voice clear and devoid of the slurred baby talk typical of his age. "Book," he said, the pronunciation crisp and cutting through the humid air. Esther's reaction was immediate and visceral. She dropped the shirt she was folding, the white fabric falling into the dust. Ignored. She stared at her son, her heart hammering against her ribs, because she knew she had only spoken that word once in his presence, weeks prior, and in a whisper. She picked him up quickly, her hands trembling, as she carried him back toward the stifling heat of the cabin. Once inside the relative safety of their quarters, she set him down and knelt before him, her eyes searching his face for confirmation of the impossible. She demanded he repeat the word, fearing it was a fluke or a trick of the wind, but he complied without hesitation. "Book," he said again, his expression placid. Then he began to list the other words he had hoarded in the vault of his mind, reciting them with the same inflection he had heard from the adults around him. Mama, Silas, Vance, monster. Each word was a perfect echo, a recording played back with high fidelity. He categorized the world not through the lens of a child's emotional understanding, but through the precise mechanism of data retention. He possessed a brain that refused to discard input, storing conversations, sounds, and rhythms with the efficiency of a ledger book. This ability, while miraculous, represented a profound danger in a society where literacy and intellect in a slave were capital offenses. Esther grasped his shoulders, her fingers digging into his skin, her face inches from his misshapen head. Her voice was a harsh whisper, laced with a terror that she could not fully conceal. She issued the command that would define his existence for the next decade and a half. She told him he must never speak like this in front of the white men, that he must never show them the speed of his mind. She instructed him to act slow, to act stupid, to become the very thing they believed him to be. She framed it not as a choice, but as a survival strategy, a mask that must never slip if he wished to avoid the lash or the noose. From that afternoon forward, Silas adopted a duality that would become the defining structure of his life. In the presence of Vance, or Master Judge, he allowed his head to loll, his mouth to hang open, and his eyes to lose their sharp focus. He drooled and stumbled, playing the role of the witless idiot with a conviction that fooled everyone who watched. He allowed himself to be the butt of jokes, the gargoyle who could barely understand commands, knowing that their arrogance was his only true shield. The performance was exhausting, requiring him to suppress every natural impulse to engage, to question, and to learn. But he executed it flawlessly. In the privacy of the cabin, however, the mask fell away to reveal a mind that was racing far ahead of its years. By the time he was 4 years old, Silas had memorized the content of every conversation he had ever overheard. He would recite them back to his mother at night, reproducing the voices of the field hands, the overseers, and the master with uncanny accuracy. He repeated the gossip about cotton prices, the arguments about weather patterns, and the hushed discussions of escape routes with the precision of a court stenographer. He possessed a mental map of the plantation's social and economic ecosystem that was far more detailed than anything written in the master's ledgers. One evening, as the sounds of the quarter settled into the rhythm of sleep, Esther asked him how he managed to retain such a volume of information. Silas touched the side of his massive head with a small hand, his gesture matter of fact. He explained that it was simply all in there, every word and every number, filed away in an architecture of memory that he could access at will. He described his mind as a library where nothing was ever lost, a concept that terrified his mother. She realized with dawning horror that her son was not just intelligent. He was a phenomenon, an entity that the world was not prepared to accept. The weight of the secret settled heavily on Esther's shoulders. She looked at her son, with his twisted spine and his massive skull, and saw the inherent danger of his existence. He was trapped in a body that invited scorn, living in a system that punished brilliance, and possessed a mind that could topple the very foundations of their world. She knew that if the truth were ever discovered, the punishment would be swift and brutal. Yet, as she watched him stare at the rafters, calculating angles and patterns, she also felt a spark of hope. The monster they reviled was harboring a power that no whip could break, and the longer he was underestimated, the more dangerous he would become. The winter of 1851 brought a relentless chill to the bayou, freezing the mud into rutted, hazardous paths and slowing the plantation's productivity to a crawl. For 6-year-old Silas, the cold seeped into his joints, exacerbating the constant ache in his neck, but his mind remained insulated from the physical misery. He had spent years absorbing the auditory landscape of the estate, cataloging the rhythms of labor and the secrets of the ruling class. However, he faced a profound limitation. His mind was a vault of spoken words, yet the written symbols that governed his existence remained a locked door. He knew that the scraps of paper the overseer guarded so jealously held the blueprints of his oppression, and without the cipher, he was powerless to alter them. His opportunity arrived not through a grand gesture of theft, but through the casual indifference of the master's family. One afternoon, while hauling ash from the main house's kitchen hearth, Silas spotted a discarded primer in the refuse pile. The book was damaged, its cover warped by humidity, and its pages stained with what appeared to be ink or perhaps food, discarded by the master's son, who had no use for a ruined text. Silas glanced around the yard, his posture deliberately slack, his mouth hanging open in the familiar mask of the idiot. Seeing no one watching, he slid the book beneath his rough tunic, the cold paper pressing against his skin like a stolen weapon. He waited until the deep black of night, when the quarters were silent, and the only sound was the distant howling of coyotes across the frozen fields. By the dying light of the hearth, he pulled the ruined book from its hiding place. The pages were brittle, covered in strange, jagged shapes that corresponded to the sounds he had heard the white children recite during their lessons. He stared at the first page, where an illustration of a small feline sat beside 3 black symbols. C-A-T, he whispered, his finger tracing the letters. The connection struck him with the force of a physical blow. The shapes were the sound, and the sound was the thing. What followed was a cognitive explosion that historians would later compare to the ignition of a powder keg. Silas did not learn to read in the conventional sense of gradual progress. Rather, he cracked the code of language in a single, sleepless session. He devoured the primer, moving from simple words to complex sentences with a terrifying speed. His massive brain, starved for structure, found in the alphabet the organizing principle it had been craving. He realized that written English was simply a system of patterns, and his mind was uniquely calibrated to recognize and store patterns. By the time the gray light of dawn crept through the cabin boards, he had memorized every word in the book. Esther stirred from her sleep to find her son still hunched over the text, his eyes bloodshot, but burning with a fierce, internal light. He was whispering to himself, testing the weight of words like justice and mercy, concepts he had never seen written before. When she reached out to touch his shoulder, he turned to her, and for the first time, she saw not a child, but a conscious agent of his own destiny. He explained the discovery with a terrifying calmness, describing the realization that the scribbles on the paper were the keys to the master's power. He told her that the book had been discarded, abandoned as trash, and that he had retrieved it to arm himself. Fear, sharp and cold, gripped Esther's heart. She knew that possession of this knowledge was a capital offense, a transgression that could lead to public whipping or even execution. She whispered that the book must be destroyed, that the risk of keeping it was too great. She reached for the pages, intending to throw them into the embers of the fire, but Silas stopped her. His voice changed, dropping the pretense of the gargoyle to reveal the cold steel beneath. He told her that he was too stupid to be caught, reminding her of the persona he had perfected. He argued that the book was no longer paper. It was ammunition. She looked into his eyes and saw an intellectual hunger that terrified her. It was a ravenous need to understand the mechanics of the world that far outweighed the fear of punishment. He told her that he could absorb the contents of this primer in 2 days, but that he would require more. He needed advanced texts, ledgers, anything with numbers and complex syntax. He spoke of his memory not as a storage bin, but as a map he was drawing in real time, a map that would one day lead them out of bondage. Esther realized that her son had crossed a threshold. He was no longer just surviving. He was preparing for war. Over the course of the next year, Silas transformed the act of scavenging into a strategic operation. He accumulated 4 more discarded texts, each one a treasure trove of information pilfered from the trash heaps and forgotten corners of the big house. He acquired a water-damaged Bible, which provided him with the archaic rhythms of authority, a farmer's almanac, which taught him the cycles of seasons and the logic of prediction, a merchant's ledger filled with the cold, unyielding truth of commerce, and a second, more advanced arithmetic text. He read them all dozens of times, his mind photographing every page. His approach to learning was not linear, but holistic. He cross-referenced the flood narratives of the Bible with the weather predictions of the almanac, and he compared the moralizing language of the scriptures with the brutal mathematics of the merchant's ledger. He began to see the inconsistencies in the system that enslaved him, the gap between the Christian rhetoric the masters preached and the cold prophet they recorded in their books. This juxtaposition fueled his anger, but he kept that anger banked like a slow-burning coal. He knew that emotion was a liability. Data was the weapon he needed to forge. Silas continued to play the role of the village idiot during the daylight hours. He would shuffle behind the mules, drool while sweeping the porch, and feign confusion when given simple orders. The overseer, Vance, continued to mock him, never suspecting that the monster he ridiculed was analyzing his vocal patterns, his drinking habits, and his accounting errors. Silas realized that his deformity was the perfect camouflage. The white men looked at his head and saw brokenness, never imagining that inside that massive skull, a counter-narrative was being written, one calculation at a time. The transition from passive observer to active participant in the plantation's economy happened silently. Silas began to understand the financial flows of the estate better than the master himself. He memorized the price of sugar per hogshead in New Orleans, the cost of shipping downriver, and the discrepancy between the weight of the cut cane and the final refined product. He saw the losses, the inefficiencies, and the thefts that were invisible to the white men who trusted their eyes but ignored their numbers. He was building a financial model of the plantation in his mind, a phantom ledger that would one day allow him to bankrupt the very ground he stood on. The boy had taught himself to read, and in doing so, he had learned how to dismantle his owners. The summer of 1853 brought a suffocating heat that clung to the bayou, settling over the cane fields like a wet wool blanket. For 8-year-old Silas, the humidity was a minor inconvenience compared to the strategic opportunity presenting itself near the grinding mill. He had observed a pattern in the behavior of the overseer, Mr. Vance, whose reliance on spirits had grown more pronounced as the temperatures rose. On this particular afternoon, Vance was engaged in a heated discussion with a visiting sugar factor regarding the plantation's yield projections, their voices raised in a cacophony of confusion and frustration. Silas swept the porch nearby, his posture bent, his eyes vacantly staring at the ground, but his ears were sharply attuned to the discrepancy in their figures. The argument hinged on the weight of the recent harvest, with Vance insisting that the numbers did not add up due to field wastage, a convenient excuse that masked his own incompetence. The factor, a man from New Orleans, argued that the percentages were mathematically impossible. Silas paused his sweeping, his mind rapidly calculating the variables he had memorized from the discarded ledgers months prior. He knew the exact capacity of the mill, the average weight of a stalk of cane, and the conversion rate of juice to crystal. The numbers Vance was quoting were not just wrong. They were fabrications designed to hide a shortfall that Silas had already tracked in his mental ledger. When the two men stormed off toward the distillery to continue their debate over whiskey, Silas saw his window of opportunity. The main house was temporarily unguarded, the master away on business in Baton Rouge. Silas shuffled toward the side door, affecting the limp of a boy whose body was failing him. He slipped inside the cool, dark hallway, moving with a purpose that contradicted his mask of idiocy. He made his way to the study, where the plantation records were kept in a heavy mahogany cabinet. The door was unlocked, as the white men believed that slaves could not read, and therefore the documents were safe from prying eyes. Inside the study, the air smelled of cigar smoke and old paper. Silas moved to the desk, where the current ledger lay open. His eyes scanned the rows of figures, absorbing the data instantly. He saw the entries Vance had made, the falsified weights, and the inflated expenses for equipment repairs that had never occurred. His photographic memory captured the pages in a fraction of a second, cross-referencing them with the mental archive he had built from the trash. The shortfall was precisely $2,300, a significant sum that Vance was skimming from the operation. The sound of boots on the gravel path outside snapped Silas back to reality. He had lingered too long, intoxicated by the clarity of the financial records. Panic flared in his chest, but he forced it down, his training taking over. There was no time to exit the way he had come. He dropped to the floor and rolled under the massive oak desk, pressing his body into the shadows. He curled his legs up, making himself as small as possible, the heavy head resting on the dusty floorboards. He controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate, becoming a piece of furniture in the gloom. The door creaked open, and heavy boots stepped into the room. It was Vance, muttering curses under his breath. The overseer walked to the desk, his boots stopping mere inches from Silas's face. Silas could see the worn leather and the mud caked on the heels. He held his breath, his entire body rigid with the effort of silence. Vance rummaged through the papers on the desk, looking for something, perhaps a bottle he had hidden there. The sound of glass clinking confirmed Silas's suspicion. The overseer took a long swig, the smell of cheap liquor filling the room. For an agonizing minute, Vance stood there, drinking in silence. Silas could feel the vibration of the man's movements through the floorboards. If Vance dropped a pen or decided to sit down, Silas would be discovered, and the penalty for a slave hiding in the master's study was death. The overseer sighed heavily, a sound of a man burdened by debt and deceit. He turned, his boot twisting on the floor, and walked toward the door. Silas watched the feet retreat, the distance between them growing, until the door finally clicked shut. Silas remained under the desk for a count of 100, ensuring that Vance was truly gone. When he finally emerged, his body was slick with cold sweat, but his mind was sharp. He now possessed the evidence needed to dismantle Vance's authority. He left the study, closing the door softly behind him, and retrieved his broom from the porch. He resumed sweeping, his face blank, just as the factor returned to the house. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs, but outwardly he was just the gargoyle moving dirt from one place to another. 3 days later, the inevitable collapse occurred. Master Judge returned from Baton Rouge to conduct his quarterly audit. Silas watched from the yard as the master sat in the study, comparing the ledgers to the banknotes. The roar of anger that erupted from the house was audible all the way to the slave quarters. Judge stormed out, dragging Vance by the collar. The overseer's face was pale, his swagger gone. The discrepancy of $2,300 had been found exactly where Silas knew it would be. The confrontation was brief and violent. Judge accused Vance of theft and incompetence, citing specific dates and figures that Silas had mentally flagged. Vance stammered, trying to blame the field hands or bad luck, but the mathematics were irrefutable. Judge docked the overseer 2 months' wages and put him on probation, threatening dismissal if the yields did not improve. It was a partial victory, but Silas saw the deeper truth. He had just used information to wound a powerful enemy without ever touching him. However, Silas had not anticipated the visceral nature of Vance's retribution. Humiliated and financially penalized, the overseer sought an outlet for his rage. He found it in the boy he considered the lowest form of life, on the plantation. Later that afternoon, Vance cornered Silas behind the smokehouse. The beating was brutal, fueled by whiskey and wounded pride. Vance struck the boy with a rawhide whip, screaming about mistakes and monsters. Silas curled into a ball, protecting his massive head, enduring the rain of blows. As the whip cracked against his back, Silas felt a strange detachment. He analyzed the pain, cataloging it alongside the victory he had achieved. He realized that Vance was beating him, not because he was useless, but because Vance sensed on some primal level that he was losing control. The overseer was lashing out at the easiest target, unaware that the monster was the architect of his downfall. Silas took the beating with a stoicism that unsettled the other slaves who watched from a distance. He did not cry out, preserving his energy for the war he knew was just beginning. When Vance finally exhausted himself and stormed off, Silas lay in the dirt, his back striped with welts. Esther found him there, her face a mask of terror and grief. She helped him to his feet, her hands shaking as she wiped the blood from his skin. Silas looked at his mother, his eyes clear and focused despite the pain. He whispered that Vance would be dismissed soon, and that this beating was merely the death rattle of a man who had already been destroyed by numbers. He had learned a crucial lesson. Physical pain was temporary, but the power to ruin a man's life was permanent. The dismissal did not happen immediately, but the seeds of Vance's destruction had been sown. Silas had proven to himself that his mind could reach out and crush a white man's livelihood, a revelation that fundamentally altered his view of his own agency. He was no longer just a survivor hiding behind a mask. He was a combatant in a silent war. As he healed from his wounds, he began to plan the next phase of his operation, realizing that intelligence alone was not enough. He needed to control the physical infrastructure of the plantation to truly secure his future. The lesson of the whip was clear. He needed to be indispensable to the master, not just invisible. The beating administered by Vance had achieved more than just superficial wounds. It had accelerated a physiological crisis that had been looming since Silas's birth. By the winter of 1853, the hours spent hunched over the ledgers in the plantation office began to exact a devastating toll on his fragile anatomy. The weight of his skull, supported by a spine forced into constant curvature by the desk work, created a compression that sent shooting pains down his back and numbed his fingers. Master Judge, observing his valuable human calculator wince while reaching for an inkwell, recognized the threat to his investment. The gargoyle was proving profitable, but the tool was threatening to break under the strain of its own operation. Judge summoned the plantation physician, a man named Dr. Almont, whose medical journals from the period detail the examination of a cranial anomaly on the Judge estate. Dr. Almont concluded that the boy's spinal column was slowly collapsing under the unprecedented mass of his head, a condition that would result in total paralysis or death within a few years if the sedentary labor continued. He recommended a shift in duties, specifically prescribing physical exertion to strengthen the musculature of the back and shoulders. The doctor suggested the forge, noting that the rhythmic motion of hammering and the upright posture required for smithing could counteract the damage caused by the accounting work. It was a decision driven purely by financial preservation, but for Silas, it was an unexpected promotion into the heart of the plantation's infrastructure. Silas was sent to the blacksmith shop on a frosty morning in January, introduced to the head smith, an older enslaved man named Titus. Titus was a figure of quiet authority on the estate, a man who had spent decades shaping iron into the tools that kept the sugar mill running. He looked at the boy with the massive head and the trembling hands, seeing only another mouth to feed and a body too weak to swing a sledgehammer. According to oral histories, Titus initially dismissed Silas as dead weight, assigning him the most menial task available, working the bellows. The old man pointed a calloused finger at the leather handle and grunted the instruction to keep the fire hot, warning the boy not to touch the iron or the tools. The work at the bellows was grueling in a different way than the ledgers. It required a steady, rhythmic pumping of air to feed the coals, a motion that burned the shoulders and tested the endurance of the lungs. For weeks, Silas stood in the background, his head ducked low, seemingly lost in the drudgery of the task. However, his mind was as active as the fire he was tending. He watched Titus with the same intensity he had applied to the arithmetic primers, absorbing the physics of the forge. He noted the color shifts in the metal, cherry red for shaping, bright orange for welding, and the specific moment of quenching that hardened the steel. He analyzed the angle of the hammer strikes and the way Titus judged the temperature by the smell of the sulfur. The transition from observer to participant was triggered by a moment of typical workplace tension. One afternoon, Titus was attempting to forge a new set of gears for the cane press, a high-stakes task that required precision. Distracted by a dispute with a field hand outside the shop, Titus allowed the iron to overheat, turning it a brittle yellow-white. He struck the metal, and it crumbled under the hammer, ruining the gear and wasting a full day's work. Titus cursed and tossed the ruined scrap into a bin, his frustration palpable. Silas, who had been pumping the bellows steadily, stopped his work and spoke in his slow, deliberate idiot voice. He commented that the iron was struck when it was orange, but cherry red was the correct temperature to prevent the metal from fracturing. Titus froze, his hammer still raised in the air. He turned slowly to stare at the boy who was supposed to know nothing of metallurgy. Silas immediately resumed his pumping, his face slack and his eyes vacant, as if the words had slipped out by accident. But the accuracy of the observation hung in the smoky air of the forge. Titus walked over to the scrap bin and retrieved the ruined gear, examining the crystalline structure of the brake. He realized that the idiot was correct. The metal had been too hot. The old smith looked at Silas with a new searching expression, a suspicion dawning in his eyes that would soon be confirmed. Later that evening, when the other field hands had retired and the forge was empty, Titus confronted Silas. He dropped the facade of the taskmaster and asked the boy directly who had taught him the science of heat treatment. Silas hesitated, weighing the risks of revealing his intelligence to another enslaved person. He decided to trust the instincts he had developed about character and drop the mask. He told Titus that he learned by watching, just as he learned everything else. He explained that his mind did not forget what it saw, and that he had been cataloging the patterns of the forge for weeks. Titus tested him, asking for the correct temperature to temper a chisel. Silas replied with the precise color and timing, his voice clear and articulate. The old smith realized that he was standing before a prodigy, a mind capable of bypassing years of apprenticeship in mere weeks. He made a silent pact with Silas, agreeing to teach him the trade properly if the boy kept his intelligence hidden from the white men. In the following months, the forge became a sanctuary where Silas could drop the drooling act and engage in the complex problem-solving of blacksmithing. He learned to shoe horses, repair plow blades, and weld the intricate parts of the sugar mill. The physical transformation was as profound as the intellectual one. By the time Silas reached his 11th birthday in 1856, the years of swinging a hammer had built a fortress of muscle across his shoulders and neck. The pain that had plagued him at the desk began to recede, replaced by a robust strength that made his deformed skull easier to carry. His hands, once stained with ink and cramped from writing, became broad and calloused, capable of manipulating red-hot steel with precision. The gargoyle was no longer just a freak of nature. He was becoming a figure of imposing physical and technical power. This dual competency, master of the books and master of the forge, gave Silas a comprehensive view of the plantation's operations that no other person, white or black, possessed. He understood the theoretical numbers that Judge obsessed over, and he understood the physical machinery that generated those numbers. He knew which tools were failing, which structures were unsound, and how much it truly cost to repair them versus what Judge believed it cost. This gap between reality and the ledger was a territory that Silas began to map with the intent of one day exploiting it for his freedom. The final test of this new phase came during the harvest of 1856, when a critical component of the cane press sheared off, bringing the entire operation to a standstill. Master Judge was in a panic, as the cane had to be processed within days, or it would rot in the fields. Mechanics from New Orleans were summoned, but they declared the part too specialized to be forged locally and ordered a replacement from a foundry in Pittsburgh, a delay that would take weeks. The potential loss in revenue was catastrophic, estimated at over $5,000. Silas watched the commotion from the forge, calculating the geometry of the broken part in his mind. Silas approached the master in the yard, affecting his stumbling gait and vacant expression. He told Judge that Monster thought he could make the part. The white mechanics laughed openly at the idea of a deformed slave boy replicating a precision component that they had deemed impossible. Judge, however, looked at Silas and remembered the ledgers. He saw a tool that had already exceeded expectations once. Desperation outweighed prejudice, and he granted Silas 2 days to attempt the repair. It was a gamble that placed the boy's life in his own hands, for failure would mean a return to the fields, or worse. Inside the forge, Silas worked with a focus that bordered on the spectral. He cast the bronze bushings and filed the gears to specifications he had calculated to the thousandth of an inch in his head. Titus watched, providing the heavy striking support, but it was Silas's hand on the file and his eye on the measurements that guided the work. For 48 hours, they labored without sleep, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal echoing across the silent quarters. Silas was not just fixing a machine. He was proving that he was the only man on the estate capable of keeping the empire running. On the morning of the third day, Silas installed the new gear into the massive iron frame of the press. The mechanics watched with sneers, waiting for the metal to shatter under the strain. Master Judge gave the order to start the rollers. The machine groaned, shuddered, and then began to turn smoothly, crushing the cane stalks into pulp with perfect efficiency. The sneers vanished, replaced by stunned silence. Judge looked at the part, then at Silas, and saw not a monster, but a source of infinite profit. Silas had rendered himself untouchable, securing the leverage he would need for the dangerous years ahead. With his successful repair of the cane press, Silas transitioned from a hidden asset to a celebrated curiosity in the regional planter class. Master Judge, recognizing the profitability of his unique property, began hiring out Silas to neighboring estates along the Bayou Teche, charging fees that ranged from $3 to $5 per day. This practice of renting skilled slaves was common, but the scale of Silas's deployment was unprecedented. He traveled between plantations with a worn leather satchel containing his tools and, secretly, his ever-growing mental map of the region's economy. Each estate he visited presented a new set of ledgers to memorize and a new hierarchy of white management to manipulate. Silas exploited the arrogance of his hosts with surgical precision. At the Boudreaux plantation, he feigned confusion while balancing the books, allowing the white clerk to correct him, only to later spot a $300 embezzlement that the clerk had successfully hidden from the owner. Silas did not reveal this immediately. Instead, he stored the information as a potential weapon. He learned to adjust his mask depending on his audience, playing the foolish gargoyle for brutish overseers while subtly demonstrating competence to owners whose greed outweighed their prejudice. By age 13, he had created a phantom network of trust, where white men believed they were using a profitable freak, unaware they were handing him the keys to their financial destruction. His reputation for mechanical wizardry grew to match his accounting fame. Silas could diagnose a failing boiler by the pitch of its hiss or repair a loom by sensing the tension in its threads. This technical indispensability granted him a degree of mobility unknown to other field hands. He moved freely between properties, a privilege that allowed him to observe the broader mechanics of the slave economy. He noted which plantations were over-leveraged with loans from New Orleans banks and which were struggling with soil exhaustion. This mobility was not just a convenience. It was the strategic high ground he needed to plan a multi-plantation escape, turning the region into a chessboard where he alone saw all the pieces. Back at the Judge estate, Silas began to systematically engineer the redundancy of the white staff, particularly the chief accountant, a nervous man named Mr. Gowan. Gowan had initially viewed Silas as a novelty, but by late 1857, he began to realize the terrifying scope of the boy's abilities. Silas made calculated errors in the presence of Gowan, minor mistakes that made the accountant feel superior, while secretly perfecting the ledgers behind his back. Gowan failed to notice that Silas had streamlined the supply chain, reducing waste by a margin that saved Judge over $1,000 in a single quarter. The final blow to Gowan's career came when Silas accidentally left a calculation open on the desk, a projection that revealed a massive upcoming loss in the sugar futures market. Gowan dismissed it as the scribbling of a fool. But when the market crashed exactly as Silas predicted, Master Judge realized his paid accountant had ignored a warning that the slave boy had somehow intuited. Gowan was dismissed within the month, his departure framed as a resignation, but understood by Silas as the removal of a surveillance camera. Now only Silas held the true numbers of the estate in his head. With Gowan gone, Silas assumed total control of the plantation's financial operations, though officially he remained a piece of property. He established a dual reality within the ledgers. One set of books, the white set, showed steady profits and conservative expenses, satisfying Master Judge's desire for stability. The other set existed only in Silas's memory. a shadow ledger that tracked the invisible money. The bribes paid to riverboat captains, the kickbacks from suppliers, and the systematic siphoning of funds into phantom expenses that Silas invented. He was building a reservoir of stolen capital that no one could trace. The mechanism of his theft was elegantly simple. When purchasing supplies from a New Orleans merchant, Silas would record the cost as $150 in the official ledger while negotiating the actual price down to $120. The difference of $30 was never recorded. Instead, it was added to a growing mental sum that Silas planned to convert into hard currency or credit under a false identity. He performed these micro-adjustments across a dozen transactions a week, knowing that the sheer volume of the plantation's business made the small discrepancies invisible to the casual eye. By 1858, Silas had insinuated himself into the confidence of the regional banking system. He was often sent to New Orleans to negotiate loans or settle accounts, a trusted proxy for Master Judge. During these trips, he cultivated the persona of a loyal, exceptionally skilled bondsman, all while memorizing the credit terms of every major planter in the Delta. He learned that the entire economic edifice of the region was built on a foundation of debt and leveraged credit, a house of cards waiting for a stiff breeze. He realized that he didn't need to overthrow the system physically. He only needed to pull out the right financial card to make it collapse. During one of these trips to the city, Silas took a decisive step toward his future liberation. He visited an obscure bank in the French Quarter, one known for discretion and dealing in irregular accounts. Using a forged letter of introduction he had drafted himself, mimicking Judge's handwriting perfectly, he established an account under the name Lucien Bro, a free man of color from Baton Rouge. He deposited an initial sum of $200, money accumulated from months of skimming small amounts from the supply budgets of 3 different plantations. This was the seed of his war chest, a financial identity that existed completely outside the sphere of slavery. The creation of the Lucien Bro identity was a psychological turning point for Silas. For years, he had been a monster, a gargoyle, a thing to be mocked. Now, in the ledgers of a New Orleans bank, he was a man of means. He walked the streets of the city on these trips, observing free black citizens who moved with a dignity he was denied on the plantation. He filed away the routes of the steamboats and the schedules of the railroads, integrating this geographical data with his financial knowledge. He was no longer just planning an escape. He was planning a transition from property to power. Silas also began to solidify his alliances within the enslaved community, though he did so with extreme caution. He trusted only 2 people implicitly: his mother, Esther, and the old blacksmith, Titus. In whispered conversations in the forge or the cabin, he began to outline the framework of a plan that went beyond personal escape. He spoke of a strike that would not be made with weapons, but with the removal of capital. He confided in Titus that he intended to break the Judge estate and several others along with it, extracting as many people as possible before the structure fell. Titus, a man who had seen decades of brutality, listened with a mix of awe and fear, recognizing that the boy was not just dreaming, but executing a complex military campaign. By the winter of 1858, Silas stood at the center of a web of his own making. He was the indispensable mechanic who kept the machines running, the accountant who kept the books balanced, and the spy who knew every secret of the planter class. The white men looked at his massive head and saw a profitable monster. Silas looked back at them and saw dead men walking. He had successfully infiltrated the machine, and his hand was now hovering over the lever that would bring it all crashing down. The time for hiding was ending. The time for the strike was approaching. The year 1859 brought a sudden jagged tear in the fabric of the local planter aristocracy. The Fontenot Estate, a sprawling sugar operation located just 12 miles upriver from the Judge plantation, fell into chaos following the sudden death of its master, a man named Augustin Fontenot. Historical property records confirm that Fontenot died intestate, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a widow, Madame Celeste Fontenot, who was desperate to liquidate the property and flee the looming financial ruin. The asking price for the land, the enslaved workforce, and the machinery was listed at $14,000, a sum that was ludicrously low, reflecting the panic of the widow and the declining yield of the exhausted soil. Master Judge saw this not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity for empire building. He summoned Silas to the study, spreading the survey maps and the bank's distress letter across the mahogany desk. Judge's eyes were alight with avarice, calculating the potential yield of merging the two operations. He asked Silas if the current liquid assets could support the purchase. Silas looked at the documents, his mind instantly accessing the true financial state of the Judge estate. A paltry $9,000 in available cash, hidden beneath a facade of prosperity. Silas knew that a straight purchase was impossible, but he saw a different opening. Silas advised his master that a direct buyout would be impossible, but suggested a structured acquisition with a down payment of $6,000 and the remaining $8,000 to be paid after the upcoming harvest. He presented this advice in his slow, hesitant cadence, pretending to struggle with the large figures. Judge, blinded by the prospect of doubling his land holdings, agreed to the terms. Silas was tasked with drafting the contract, a responsibility he accepted with a feigned trembling of hands. This was the moment Silas had been waiting for, the insertion of the legal Trojan horse. Working by candlelight in the office, Silas drafted the purchase agreement with the precision of a seasoned attorney. He buried 3 critical clauses deep within the dense legal script of the document. Clause 14 stipulated that, in the event of a default on the loan used to secure the property, the management of the Fontenot estate would revert to an interim administrator to prevent asset stripping. Clause 20 defined the interim administrator as the primary financial manager of record, a title Silas currently held. Clause 29 waived the requirement for the owner's signature on transfer documents in cases of fiscal emergency, requiring only the validation of the parish clerk. Judge signed the document without reading the fine print, trusting that his gifted savant had simply transcribed the standard boilerplate. The deal was struck, and the Fontenot estate passed into Judge's possession. Silas now controlled the financial architecture of 2 major plantations, doubling the complexity of his shadow ledger. He immediately began to integrate the Fontenot accounts into his siphoning system, identifying the inefficiencies in their sugar processing and the corrupt practices of their remaining overseers. The phantom surplus in his Lucien Bro account began to swell, fed by the double flow of skimming from both operations. As the months progressed, Silas intensified the abstraction of funds. He exploited the confusion of the merger, creating invoices for equipment repairs that never occurred and shipping costs for imaginary routes. The mental strain of maintaining 2 distinct financial realities, the profitable lie for Judge and the crumbling truth for himself, was immense. Silas found himself awake deep into the night, his massive head throbbing as he calculated interest rates and depreciation schedules in the dark. He was walking a razor's edge. A single audit by a competent outsider could expose the missing $11,000 he had diverted over the years. The pressure began to manifest physically. Silas, now 14, grew thin, his eyes sunken into the deep sockets of his skull. Esther watched her son with growing alarm, seeing the fire of his intellect consuming his body. She begged him to slow down, to take less, but Silas refused. He explained that the system was fragile, and that the coming war whispers of which were drifting up from the south, would soon make money worthless unless it was converted into freedom. He needed to extract every possible cent before the bubble burst. He was no longer just stealing wages, he was stealing the means to dismantle a world. By the spring of 1860, Silas's shadow operations had expanded to include 3 smaller farms, for which Judge provided financial oversight. He was managing the credit lines for a dozen neighbors, making him the central node in a vast interconnected web of debt. He saw clearly that the regional economy was a Ponzi scheme, with planters borrowing against future harvests to pay past interest. Silas began to subtly accelerate the decline of the most vulnerable nodes. He would delay critical payments by a few days or misfile loan extensions, ensuring that the banks began to squeeze his enemies just enough to weaken them without triggering a total collapse that would destroy his own position. His ultimate goal during this period was the accumulation of leverage. He began to collect the secrets of the white elite with the same fervor he collected their money. He memorized the contents of private letters left unguarded on desks, documenting the extramarital affairs, the secret gambling debts, and the illegal land speculations of the parish's leading citizens. He compiled a mental dossier of destruction, a catalog of scandals that he could unleash if his own safety were ever threatened. He was building a shield of pure information, ensuring that any attack on him would result in the mutual destruction of the attacker. The acquisition of the Fontenot estate also provided Silas with the physical infrastructure he needed for the next phase of his plan. The property included an isolated granary on the far edge of the border, far from the main house and rarely visited by the white overseers. Silas designated this structure as the staging ground for the escape he had been designing for years. He began to secretly repair the locks and reinforce the floorboards, telling Judge he was securing the grain stores against rats. In reality, he was building a vault to hide the people he intended to steal away from the master's grasp. Silas's influence had become so pervasive that Master Judge could no longer make a move without consulting his monster. The dynamic had shifted entirely. Judge believed he was the master of a growing empire, but he was actually a puppet dancing on strings held by a 14-year-old boy. The arrogance of the white man was his blindness. He could not conceive that a slave, let alone one he considered physically and mentally defective, could outmaneuver him at every turn. Silas fostered this delusion, feeding Judge's ego with inflated profit projections while quietly arranging the master's financial execution. By the winter of 1860, the stage was set for the final act. Silas had control of the ledgers, the legal clauses, and the physical roots. He had amassed a fortune of over $12,000 in the New Orleans bank account and held the secrets of half the parish in his memory. He looked at the white men who rode past him on the road, tipping their hats to Master Judge while ignoring the gargoyle sweeping the porch, and felt a cold, hard certainty settle in his gut. They were ghosts, walking through a world that was about to be burned down around them. The time for patience was ending, and the time for action had arrived. He was ready to trigger the collapse. The summer of 1861 brought the distant drums of war to the bayou, but a more immediate threat arrived on horseback in the form of a notorious slave catcher named Dalton. He rode into the Judge plantation with a demeanor of casual violence, bearing a tattered warrant that authorized him to search the quarters for a runaway believed to have fled from a plantation near Baton Rouge. Dalton was a man whose profession attracted the sadistic and the desperate, and he viewed every plantation as a hunting ground. Master Judge was away on business, leaving the white staff uneasy and the enslaved population on edge. Dalton demanded immediate access to the slave quarters, his hand resting threateningly on the pistol at his hip. Silas was in the main office, sorting receipts, when Dalton burst in, smelling of sweat and stale tobacco. The slave catcher looked at the boy with the massive head and sneered, making a crude joke about the curiosities of the Delta. He demanded to know where the master was and who was in charge. Silas dropped his gaze, assuming the vacant expression of the gargoyle, his shoulders hunching inward. He replied in his slow, slurred voice that the master was gone to the city and that monster just counted the papers. Dalton laughed, dismissing the boy as a prop, unaware that he was being analyzed with the precision of a military tactician. Dalton insisted on searching the quarters immediately, refusing to wait for the overseer's return. He claimed the runaway was dangerous and needed to be apprehended before nightfall. Silas knew that a man fitting the description was actually hiding in the hayloft of the old granary on the Fontenot edge, a fact Silas had known for 2 days. If Dalton conducted a random, aggressive search, he might stumble upon the hidden man or, worse, uncover the supplies Silas had been stockpiling in the granary for his own escape. Silas needed to redirect the hunter without raising suspicion of his own intelligence. Silas feigned a nervous tremble, glancing toward the window as if terrified. He told Dalton in a quavering voice that he had seen a strange man earlier that morning, not in the quarters, but near the river landing. He described a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, matching the general description of the runaway, but he added a specific, false detail. He claimed the man was trying to steal a boat to cross the bayou. Dalton's eyes lit up at the prospect of a chase. Catching a runaway attempting to flee via the river was easier and more lucrative than combing through dense cane fields. Dalton demanded to know exactly which direction the man went. Silas pointed south, toward the treacherous swampland that bordered the plantation, away from the granary, where the actual fugitive was concealed. He emphasized that the man was moving fast and looked desperate. Dalton, believing the fool had no reason to lie and lacked the wit to fabricate a story, mounted his horse and spurred it toward the river. Silas watched him go, his face a mask of fear, but his mind coldly calculating the man's trajectory. He had successfully baited the hunter, but the danger was far from over. Silas knew he had to act quickly. The runaway in the granary was a liability as long as Dalton was in the area. If Dalton returned empty-handed from the river, he would likely double back and search the outbuildings with renewed vigor. Silas slipped out of the office and made his way to the forge under the guise of running an errand. He found Titus and communicated the situation with a series of subtle hand signals they had developed over the years, a silent language of resistance born of necessity. Titus nodded and melted into the shadows to warn the hidden man. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Silas executed a miniature version of the larger operation he was planning. He made his way to the granary with forged travel papers he had produced in the office that afternoon, using the name of a free black man from the parish records. He handed the papers to the fugitive, a terrified young man named Jerome, and gave him precise directions to a safe house run by abolitionists in the northern part of the state. Silas had memorized the location from a letter he had intercepted months prior, adding it to his mental map of the Underground Railroad. Jerome hesitated, skeptical that a boy with a massive head and a reputation for being slow could possess such resources. Silas dropped the mask for a fleeting moment, his voice sharp and commanding as he ordered the man to move. He explained that the slave catcher was patrolling the southern perimeter, and that this was the only window for escape. Jerome, recognizing the authority in Silas's tone, took the papers and vanished into the tall grass. Silas watched him go, feeling the heavy weight of responsibility. Every soul he helped slip through the cracks was a victory, but also a risk that could expose his own intricate web. Dalton returned the next morning, furious and mud-splattered, having found no trace of a man near the river. He accused the field hands of lying and threatened to whip the information out of them, but Silas intervened. He approached Dalton with a look of confused distress, claiming that he had seen the strange man swimming across the bayou and disappearing into the swamp. Dalton, faced with the simpleton's tearful insistence and the lack of any evidence to the contrary, was forced to accept that his quarry had likely drowned or escaped the territory. He cursed the swamp and rode off to continue his hunt elsewhere, leaving the plantation behind. The incident with Dalton served as a crucible for Silas's ultimate plan. It proved that his forged documents could withstand scrutiny, and that he could manipulate the movements of dangerous white men with nothing but a carefully constructed lie. He had saved a life and protected his own infrastructure, but the close call reinforced the fragility of his position. He could not save everyone, and he could not linger indefinitely. The Lucium Bro account now held over $13,000, and the political climate was deteriorating rapidly. The war between the states was no longer a distant rumor. It was a looming reality that threatened to upend the financial systems he had been exploiting. Silas returned to his ledgers with a renewed sense of urgency. He began to accelerate the timeline for the final phase of his operation. The escape of Jerome was a test run, a successful proof of concept for the mass extraction he intended to execute. He realized that he needed to solidify his legal position before the chaos of war reached the bayou. He began to draft the final set of documents he would need. Freedom papers for 12 specific individuals, each one carefully backdated and notarized with a forgery of the parish clerk's seal. These papers would be his final gift, the legal shields that would allow his people to walk away when the empire finally burned. As he worked by the light of a single tallow candle, Silas felt the burden of his destiny. He was 17 years old, a monster in the eyes of the world, yet he held the power of life and death in his hands. He could see the machinery of the plantation grinding toward a halt, the gears stripped by his own design. The shadow war he had been fighting was about to become a tangible reality. He touched the side of his massive head, feeling the scars of a lifetime of ridicule, and whispered a promise to the darkness that the reckoning was coming. The system had created him, and now he was going to dismantle it, bolt by bolt. The winter of 1862 brought a biting frost to the bayou, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the financial freeze gripping the Judge estate. A letter arrived from the New Orleans bank, stamped with urgent red ink, demanding immediate repayment of a call loan amounting to $8,500. The bank was tightening its belts in anticipation of Union blockades, calling in debts to shore up liquidity. Master Judge sat in his study, the document trembling in his hands, his face pale as the frost on the window pane. The empire he had built on leverage and ambition was teetering on the edge of a precipice. Judge summoned Silas to the study, his voice cracking with panic. For the first time, the master asked the slave for advice, not as a curiosity, but as a last resort. He showed Silas the bank's ultimatum and demanded to know if the liquid assets were sufficient to cover the debt. Silas examined the letter with feigned confusion, his finger tracing the lines of text slowly. He knew the answer before he even accessed his mental ledger. Judge had exactly $4,200 in available cash, a little more than half of what was needed. The rest was tied up in imaginary projections and phantom surpluses that Silas had manufactured. Silas hesitated, appearing to struggle with the numbers, before suggesting in his slow voice that Monster could maybe find the money by selling some assets and moving numbers around. Judge, desperate and devoid of other options, nodded vigorously. He granted Silas full authority to do whatever was necessary to save the estate. He handed over the keys to the strongbox and signed a general power of attorney, effectively handing the keys of the kingdom to the gargoyle. It was the moment Silas had spent 12 years engineering. The master had voluntarily dismantled his own defenses. Silas immediately began a 30-day countdown to destruction. He locked himself in the office, drawing the heavy velvet curtains to shield his work from prying eyes. His first action was to consolidate the stolen fortune. Over the next week, he executed a series of complex financial maneuvers, transferring funds from the accounts of the 3 plantations he managed into the Lucian Bro account in New Orleans. He wrote checks for non-existent expenses, created invoices for fictional machinery repairs, and siphoned the phantom surplus he had accumulated over the years. By day 7, he had moved $12,000 into his untraceable account, leaving Judge's actual operating accounts hollowed-out shells. On day 10, Silas prepared the human element of his extraction. He visited the 12 individuals he had chosen for freedom, including his mother, Esther, and his ally, Titus. He moved through the quarters at night, whispering instructions and handing out the forged freedom papers he had kept hidden for months. He told them the date, February the 14th, 2 days before the bank loan was due. He instructed them to pack light, wear sturdy shoes, and be ready to move the moment the plantation bell tolled midnight. The tension in the quarters was palpable. The stakes were life and death, and Silas was the only thing standing between them and the noose. While Silas prepared the people, he simultaneously sabotaged the estate's credibility. He drafted letters on Judge's stationery to major creditors in Baton Rouge and New Orleans. These letters, written in a hand that mimicked Judge's signature perfectly, admitted to insolvency and implied that the plantation's assets had been seized by the bank. He calculated that these letters would arrive just after the escape, ensuring that when the truth came out, Judge's reputation would be destroyed beyond repair, making any attempt to recover the stolen property logistically impossible. On day 14, Silas made his move on the legal infrastructure. He traveled to the parish courthouse, ostensibly to file routine land deeds for Judge. While the clerk was distracted by a heated argument over a land dispute, Silas accessed the registry of free persons. He slipped the 12 freedom papers into the bound volumes, backdating the entries to 1859 and stamping them with the official seal he had lifted from the clerk's desk during a previous visit. The papers now appeared to be legitimate historical records, legally manumitting the 12 individuals years prior. If caught, they could claim to be free people wrongfully enslaved. As the deadline approached, Silas stoked Judge's fragile hope. He showed the master falsified bank drafts and letters of credit that suggested the money was incoming from the sale of a non-existent timber tract. Judge, clutching at straws, believed the lifeline was real. He stopped questioning Silas's movements, his mind consumed by the fantasy of salvation. Silas watched the master's relief with a cold detachment, knowing that in less than 48 hours, the man's world would dissolve. The monster was holding the master's hand, leading him gently toward the cliff edge. The night of the escape arrived under the cover of a heavy thunderstorm, the rain drumming against the shingles of the cabins like a drum roll. Silas moved through the darkness, gathering the 12 people at the edge of the north field. There was no time for tears or long goodbyes. He checked their papers one last time, his eyes meeting Esther's in the dark. She squeezed his hand, her grip fierce and proud. He pointed them toward the old Indian trail that led away from the bayou, a route he had mapped from the geography books he had memorized years ago. Silas watched them disappear into the rain, 12 souls walking toward a new life. He felt a surge of emotion that he quickly suppressed. The mission was not complete. He had to ensure the door slammed shut behind them and could never be opened again. He returned to his cabin, soaked and shivering, but his mind was clear. The pieces were all in position. The money was stolen, the papers were filed, and the people were gone. All that remained was the final act of the drama, the moment where the gargoyle would reveal his true face to his tormentor. The next morning, the day the loan was due, Silas walked to the big house with a slow, deliberate pace. He entered the study where Judge was pacing, waiting for the bank transfer that would save him. Silas stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the man who had called him a mistake, a loss, a monster. He dropped the heavy satchel of books he was carrying, letting them thud onto the floorboards. The sound startled Judge, who spun around, his eyes wide with desperate hope. He asked if the money had arrived, if the crisis was averted. Silas looked at the master, and for the first time in his life, he stood up straight. He dropped the mask. His face smoothed out, losing its slackness, and his eyes sharpened into points of intense, cold fire. He spoke in a voice that was clear, articulate, and utterly devoid of the fool cadence. He told Judge that there was no money coming. He explained with a terrifying calmness that he had spent the last decade robbing the master blind, that the $8,500 was gone, and that the estate was effectively bankrupt. The revelation hung in the air like a gunshot, shattering the master's reality instantly. Master Judge stared at the boy, his mind struggling to process the sudden shift in reality. The voice that came from the gargoyle was not the slow, fumbling drawl of a simpleton, but the crisp, clipped diction of a scholar. Silas stepped further into the room, his posture erect, his massive head held high without a tremor. He began to itemize the destruction with the precision of a coroner's report. He spoke of the phantom surplus, the inflated invoices, and the $12,000 that now sat securely in a New Orleans bank account under the name Lucien Bro. Judge's face contorted, moving from confusion to a beet-red fury, his hands clutching the edge of the desk as if the floor were tilting beneath him. The master lunged across the desk, his intention to choke the life from the boy clear in his eyes. Silas did not flinch. He stood his ground, his expression one of bored anticipation. He calmly produced a document from his jacket pocket and placed it on the mahogany surface between them. It was the deed to the Fontenot estate, the property Judge had purchased years ago. Silas recited the clauses he had buried in the contract, explaining that upon default of the loan, which had occurred that morning, the management of the property reverted to the administrator of record. Silas declared that he was that administrator, and that he was legally transferring the title to the Abolitionist Society of Pennsylvania. Judge froze, his fingers inches from Silas's throat, as the legal trap snapped shut. Silas continued his narration, his voice cutting through the silence. He revealed that the 12 missing slaves were not runaways in the eyes of the law, but free people, their manumission papers filed and stamped in the parish records months ago. He watched the realization wash over Judge. He was not just broke. He was operationally crippled. The skilled labor, the knowledge of the land, and the financial infrastructure had all been hollowed out. Silas leaned forward slightly, his massive skull casting a long shadow over the cowering master. He told Judge that the monster had been the only thing holding the fragile empire together, and now that the monster had walked away, the structure was bound to collapse. Judge sputtered, threatening to call the constable, to have Silas hanged for theft and fraud. Silas responded by pulling out a final piece of paper, a freedom paper for himself. He claimed it had been filed via a legal loophole he had exploited 6 months prior. While the document was a masterful forgery, Silas knew it would hold up long enough to confuse the authorities and buy him the time he needed to vanish. He looked at the man who had deemed him worthless and declared that the head judge had mocked contained the entire blueprint of the man's destruction. With a final cold nod, Silas turned his back on the master and walked out of the study. Silas moved through the house, past the parlors where white men had once laughed at his deformity, and out the front door. He did not run. He walked with a steady, measured gait down the shell-lined path toward the main gate. The morning sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. He carried nothing but the clothes on his back and the $12,000 in his mental account. As he passed the fields where he had once been beaten, he did not look back. The gargoyle was gone, and in his place walked a free man, moving north toward a new identity. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Master Judge. Within the week, the bank seized the main house and the remaining assets. The letters Silas had forged to creditors arrived, destroying Judge's credit and reputation in the city. Judge found himself abandoned by the society that had once admired his ambition, left with a ruined estate and the bitter knowledge that he had been outsmarted by a slave. He died 2 years later, a broken man, his name erased from the rolls of the planter aristocracy, a footnote in the history of his own downfall. The mistake he had tried to discard had become the architect of his oblivion. Silas traveled north, blending into the chaos of the war-torn country. He used his forged papers to cross Union lines, where he eventually accessed his funds in New Orleans. He adopted the name Samuel Freeman, a nod to the freedom he had carved out of his own suffering. He settled in Philadelphia, a city far from the humid bayous of his youth. There, he used his fortune to establish a bank specifically designed to lend money to newly freed families, helping them purchase land and build businesses. The fool, who had memorized the mechanics of slavery, now used that same brilliance to fuel the economic rise of his people. For the next 2 decades, Samuel Freeman operated in the shadows of the abolitionist movement, funding legal battles and secretly supporting the Underground Railroad's transition into education networks. He never married, dedicating his life to the accumulation of leverage and capital for the disenfranchised. His past remained a tightly guarded secret. To the world, he was a wealthy, eccentric recluse with a severe curvature of the spine. No one knew that the twisted body housed a mind that had once bankrupted a plantation empire. He lived quietly, his victory a silent hum in the back of his mind. Esther lived out her days in a small brick house in Philadelphia, her hands finally free from the calluses of the cane knife. She would sit on her porch and watch the neighborhood children play, her heart swelling with the knowledge that her son had kept his promise. She saw him not as the monster the world had labeled him, but as the savior he had willed himself to be. The bond between them, forged in the dirt of the slave quarters, remained unbreakable until her death at the age of 74. She passed away in her sleep, a free woman, her last breath a sigh of contentment. Old Titus, the blacksmith who had been Silas's only true confidant on the plantation, lived long enough to see the dawn of a new century. He remained a pillar of the community, a man who knew the weight of iron and the value of silence. He often told stories to the younger generation about the boy with the giant head, though few believed the tall tales of a slave who destroyed his master with nothing but a ledger book. Yet Titus knew the truth, and he carried it like a precious ember, a testament to the power of the mind to overcome the chains of the body. In 1883, Samuel Freeman died quietly in his sleep at the age of 40. His obituary in the Philadelphia Gazette was brief, listing him as a philanthropist and banker. It made no mention of Louisiana, or Master Judge, or the 12 souls he had led out of bondage. However, the funeral was attended by hundreds of people, whose lives had been touched by his quiet generosity. Among the mourners was an old man with calloused hands who stood by the grave and wept. Titus delivered the eulogy, his voice trembling with emotion. Titus stood before the crowd, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the free black citizens who had gathered to honor the monster. He spoke of a boy who was born into the deepest pit of degradation, but had climbed out using the very tools of the oppressor. He told them that freedom was not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of power. He concluded by saying that the smartest man he ever knew had taught him that patience was the sharpest weapon of all. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, the legend of Silas was sealed, not as a victim of fate, but as the architect of his own destiny. The boy they called a mistake had become the man who rewrote history,